What's happening, tennis fans? Today we are talking about the serve, and not just any old serve. We're talking about establishing a weapon, an advanced serve, not a serve that you're just working to get into the court to start the point, an advanced serve. All right, and so these are the essential pieces. I'm not going to give you a bunch of fluff today. Let's start with number one, the serve stance. And you're like, oh man, the stance really? It's huge. It's a really big piece of the serve, because if you start incorrectly, the rest of the serve can't connect. The kinetic chain just falls apart. The first link is broken. So what you want to make sure that you're doing, and it's simple, is taking a stance to where the back toe lines up with the front heel. And the reason being is that you can see here, this is that it opens the hip. We want to make sure that we have the ability to open the hip. And now this doesn't matter if you're pinpoint, if you're platform, because ultimately, even if I go pinpoint, I'm going to pull this foot up. And if I'm platform, I'm simply going to keep the stance neutral where it is. I'm going to keep the feet still. Now you can play with it to some degree. Certainly some players like to kind of open this back toe a little bit to help the hip. Some players like to have the foot a little bit further back, especially on pinpoint, so it doesn't line up precisely. But regardless of what we do, we have to have the ability to rotate the hip so that we can coil the upper and lower body as a unit. Now this is the same if you're throwing a ball, but remember in tennis, like we're throwing a ball up, think like Hail Mary, like you're throwing it more straight up than you are out. But if you were gonna throw, you wanna pull your foot out in front and lock out the hip. You gotta drop the hip back so that you can throw nice and high and far. So I know what some of you are thinking. You're like, Nate, you started with the stance. You didn't even talk about the grip. You always talk about the grip. It's continental grip. If you don't have a continental grip, it's going to be extremely difficult to get the serve to be a legitimate weapon. You're not going to get into the 100-mile-per-hour club. Got to make sure that it's continental. We'll link a video. We're not going to get into it here. I know it's frustrating. The continental grip is really, really tough. But please, if you haven't got used to it yet, just stay with it. You will. But up next, number two, we're going to talk about the toss. Also difficult a lot of times because it's the one thing that you control. This is the one thing you have to remember about the toss. No matter what your preference of tossing, the ball always has to be in the fingertips and not the palm. So whether you're ice cream cone like Roger Federer or you like your palm up, that's just personal preference. Doesn't matter as long as the ball is in the tips of your fingers. Now, what you want to make sure though is that you're locking out your wrist and your elbow, and you're just tossing with the shoulder and then the hip in a relationship that is codependent, right? That they're going to work as a unit from this motion, all right? Now, you want to make sure that you don't have a disjointed knee bend. We do see this a lot of times with some players when they're bending down and then they're raising the ball up. That's not the same as getting the hip up, all right? Tilting the hip back and getting the tossing arm up. The reason being is that if you go down here to get your toss up, how do you then get back into your knee bend? So don't do that. Now, really, really important to mention, on the toss, the tossing arm has to stay up to help this tilt. This is what we reference as the shoulder and hip rear pelvic tilt. And so the idea here is that as you're working through your motion, as the ball goes up and the arm stays up, you get into this shoulder and hip rear pelvic tilt. This is one of two ways of creating power. When you have two of them combined between coiling, which we'll talk about next, and the tilt, you have access just to a ton of power. That's what we see on both of the tours. Now, I know I'm going to get asked this questions in the comments. How far out into the court do I toss? Well, as far as you're willing to jump or can jump. If you're Nick Kyrgios, you're going to toss a little bit further than the mere mortals. But a good frame of reference is that if your arm is fully extended and you allow the ball to operate up, that's typically going to be far enough to make sure that you have your contact out in front with the racket inside the court. That is key. We don't want the contact, obviously, back behind our head. All right, so up next, we're talking about the first move, which is the coil, and this is about getting the racket moving, right? As we get the racket moving, we should also be coiling our body. Now, you may have noticed on the tours, you're seeing a lot less of the pendulum where the racket works back here and then gets to the trophy position. It's going to be much easier for us to do that as well, and this is where the racket is operating to the side of the body to then get momentum, and this is plenty. The racket's moving plenty in this particular style, this abbreviated style. And not only that, it's easier to keep consistent because there's less moving parts. So the way this is going to look here is that you still want to make sure that the tossing arm leads, right? And so if you're more comfortable going down and then allowing the tossing arm to lead, that's fine as well. But as the tossing arm starts to lead, the racket is going to work with the palm down. Now, it doesn't have to be all the way down. If you're more comfortable keeping it more at a 45, that's totally fine, but your palm does need to be facing down, all right? So from here, if suddenly you're neutral, that you're gonna end up falling into a waiter's tray, which is problematic for all the reasons, all right? But so as the toss leads, the racket is moving from here, and then the coil gets the elbow on the non-dominant side of the body. So here, where I have this center line through my body, I want the arm on the non-dominant side as it works from the right to left. And number 4 is the right to left, which we just referenced. So the right to left, I want you to think of it this way. So from here, from this position, you can see the elbow in the correct position. I'm drawing my elbow back. A great way to think of this is that somebody's sneaking up on you and trying to steal your wallet and you're throwing that elbow, right? So you're here, but from here, we've got to get the racket moving this way, and this is the right to left. And this really, the reason I'm kind of blending these two steps is they kind of work together. So as it works from here, as the elbow goes back, the racket is then pulled this way. And this is where you hear the popular, like, knock the cone off the head, knock the birthday hat, as Ryan Reedy likes to reference it. These are where you hear this step. Does every serve necessarily come across the head? No, but every serve does have a right to left. It may be back this way, but it still has to move in that right to left fashion. All right, step 5 is all about the lower body. We got to load energy through the ground. We want to get these legs really engaged. All right, this is where the kinetic change starts. So as I push energy down, don't just think about this as bending your knees. You're really trying to get the body loaded, just like you were if you were to do a high jump, right? So from here, as you load energy down, this is then going to fire the knee, which will fire the back hip, and then the shoulder and elbow up to the ball. All right, this is a really important mechanism of the serve. 50% of power is going to come from this leg drive. Now, let me distinguish. Loading is not necessarily jumping. You don't have to jump super high. If you're simply going from here and that is as high as you jump, all good, no worries, because you're still loading that energy. But what you do have to make sure you're doing is keeping the hand nice and loose so it can operate as a bullwhip, so that driving force of the legs can allow it to really work through up to the contact point. So when you're doing this, just make sure energy goes up and then out. Jumping up into a small platform on the court is a great way to practice the proper loading and jumping mechanism that's involved in the serve, that is required on the serve. So you might be thinking, all right, yeah, Nate, I know, jump, elbow, all that. I just can't get the racket drop to happen organically. Well, we've talked about this a lot in our videos, Scott, and I've really talked about how to focus on the position of the elbow and not the racket, because if the elbow fires up to the ball, the racket will be in a racket drop position. Now, what's key is that the elbow doesn't fire up this way. It really comes up and over, and this is more like a cartwheel, if you will, like the cartwheel effect. When you hear coaches reference this is what they're talking about. And we've talked about a great way to practice this is to simply give the elbow something to aim at. So as you toss the ball nice and low, allow the elbow to come around. It's just a nice way to get the feeling of what the elbow should be doing on the serve. Another way that you can think about it is just doing it nice and slow. Another way you can practice it is nice and slow. Hold the racket with just 3 fingers, and from here, as you work up through your motion and the leg powers down and the elbow goes up, allow the racket to dangle behind you. With holding with such a loose grip and limited fingers on the racket, it becomes really easy from here as you pulse up to allow that racket to drop. Now what you'll see here, this is the key position of the elbow. It can be a little bit here or in this position, but we want the elbow up, all right? Because what we see with more players than not is an issue to where when they go up to the serve, they internally rotate and the arm comes around here. And even if the racket gets into a racket drop, it gets really limited. It doesn't really get deep like it would if it was in this position. So fire the elbow up and over to the contact point. All right, so now we got to talk about actually hitting the ball. The contact point, as you're working up to the ball from here, the highest point that you can make contact is 12 o'clock. Now, you can hit a flat serve from 12 to 1. The thing to be mindful of is that if you're hitting at 12, as you come across, the body really has to have a rotation. You see my head tilted here, and this is going to keep my shoulder nice and safe. For most of us, we're going to aim at 1 o'clock. But the key here is that I really want to make sure that contact is out in front and the arm is fully extended. And the next piece is all about internal shoulder rotation. So from contact, I want to make sure the racket doesn't keep moving across my body. I want to allow the racket to follow through the contact. So there's the contact. I let the racket continue to go. And then from here, you'll see the racket tip start facing off at a 45, off at an angle, not like this, obviously not like this, right? Out at an angle. And from here, we get into that internal shoulder rotation. Now, internal shoulder rotation, what I'm referencing is you can see here where my shoulder stays in a line with my elbow as the racket comes down. This is actually what we hear, I think, coaches, when they're talking about like a wrist snap. That is what you really want to be feeling. No matter what, your wrist should have a snap, because that's the gift that we've been given in our anatomy, is that the wrist is very mobile in that direction, the ability to snap forward, right? If our wrist was fixed, we wouldn't be able to hit a very hard serve. It'd be like swinging a stick instead of swinging a bullwhip. Last but not least, we're talking about the landing. This is sticking the landing. You can see this in the demo that there should be a full weight transfer. So as you're going up to hit contact, we see shoulder over shoulder. Now the right shoulder, which was below the left, now comes up and around, and the right shoulder's above the left, which means that the left foot should strike the ground as the right foot is kicked back. This is that full scorpion that you hear it reference a lot, to where the back foot, the dominant foot, is kicking back for counterbalance and sticking the landing with the left. Now, it's really important, we talk about the serve. People get in trouble with their serve because this puts them out into the court. You just got to remember to recover back as quickly as you can. All right, my friends, that is today's video on the serve. A lot of moving parts, but if you just simplify and take time to work on each individual part and start putting them together, you're going to have a fluid, rhythmic serve that gives you a lot of really easy power without all the effort. And that's what we all want. That's what we see on tour. It looks like they're dropping $130 without hardly even trying, except Ben Shelton. That dude looks like he's just jumping into the universe. If you can be Ben Shelton, be Ben Shelton, right? But thanks so much for watching. I will see you next time.